in February of 2007. And it was actually very well timed because the market really started falling apart, just a couple of weeks after the book came out. And during the course of the time when I was writing it, starting probably in 2005, is when I started going on television, warning about what I saw as a major financial collapse coming in the United States. And I started, the first one I went on was CNBC. And there they started calling me Dr. Doom because of the things I was saying. But I started going on all the shows. I mean, I was on CNBC probably every week for a couple of years, but I was also going on CNN, I was going on Fox, I was going on Bloomberg, I was going on whatever television shows would have me on. I was also speaking on talk radio, and I started speaking at investment conferences, industry groups around the country, warning about what was going to happen to the economy, to the real estate market, to the stock market, and nobody believed it. It was just like in the dot-com days. Nobody believed it. It was a mania. Everybody thought it was a new era, that the economy was in great shape, but I knew differently. What I knew is that it was a phony, it was an illusion, that all we were doing was spending borrowed money, that all of our GDP growth was not because the economy was growing. We weren't increasing our industrial output, we weren't growing the real economy. We were spending money we didn't have. We were buying things that we couldn't afford and things that we didn't make. We ran enormous trade deficits. Our monthly trade deficit was going at $50, $60 billion a month. Right? We borrowed trillions of dollars from the Chinese, from the Japanese, from the Saudis, and we just spent the money. We spent it remodeling houses and putting granite countertops on the kitchens and buying Viking appliances. And we spent it on all kinds of gadgets that we really couldn't afford. And all the time we were spending this borrowed money, Washington was loving it. Wall Street was loving it. Everything was great. But I knew differently. And eventually, a lot of my forecasts were vindicated. By 2008, the bubble collapsed, and many of the forecasts that I made came true. Unfortunately, our leaders in Washington have learned nothing from their mistakes. Their foolish policy inflated the real estate bubble. When that burst, they did the same thing. They created a housing bubble. Now that's collapsed on them, and now they're doing the exact same thing. What President Obama is doing right now is the same thing that Bush did. He is trying to stimulate the economy so that we can't have a recession. Unfortunately, the recession is necessary because of all the foolish things we did during the housing bubble. Because the Federal Reserve enticed Wall Street into reckless speculation and Main Street into reckless consumption, the economy is all screwed up. The resources need to be rebalanced. But the government won't let that happen because of the stimulus. The problem is the stimulus under Obama is worse because it's bigger. The deficits now are $1.6 trillion in the next year, in 1 year. And of course, Greenspan had interest rates at 1%. Bernanke's got them at 0. So if we got into all this mess with 1%, imagine the damage that they're doing with 0. Because what the problem is now, the economy is all screwed up. For years and years, we spent too much money. So what does that mean? Well, that means we got to spend less. We got to save. We're in debt. We have to save our money. The government got too big. It's got to shrink, right? We have been consuming too much, but we haven't produced enough. So the solution is we got to consume less and produce more. We got to make more things. We've got to restructure our economy because it's all screwed up now because of what the government did to it. When the markets collapsed in 2008 and all these banks went under, it wasn't a failure of capitalism. It wasn't because of greed on Wall Street. It was a failure of government, a failure of central planning, a failure of socialism. It was government rules and regulations that distorted the free market, that made things happen that never would have happened. And the solutions don't involve more government. They're going to involve less government. The bigger the government gets, the more expensive government is, the more resources it has to drain from the private sector. And if we have fewer resources, we can't grow. I mean, the reason so many people are unemployed is because Washington is sucking the life out of the private sector. Sure, a lot of the stimulus is benefiting Wall Street, but none of that helps Main Street. Wall Street is getting rich, but they're bleeding the country dry because they're not producing anything with that money. They're taking all this cheap money and gambling with it. But that's money that's no longer available. When the government borrows $1 trillion, and when the government guarantees somebody's mortgage or guarantees someone's student loan, where's that money coming from? It's coming out of the domestic pool of savings. There's nothing left. The only way that we can get jobs in a market-based economy, I create some jobs. I have about 100 employees. I'm sure there are some people in this room that have employees. But jobs just don't spring They don't just, people don't create jobs because they're humanitarians. Businessmen create jobs because it helps them make more money. They get a greater profit. Businesses have capital, other people have labor, and you combine other people's labor with your capital and you make a profit. But A, if I don't have any capital, or if businesses can't get capital, you can't give anybody a job. And if I'm not going to make a profit, why am I going to hire somebody? And so if the government makes it difficult to accumulate capital by taxing it to death or borrowing it out of existence, if they make it harder for businesses to make a profit and expand by layering them with unnecessary regulations and burdening some taxes, no one's going to create any jobs. They're just going to figure out how many jobs they can eliminate so they can stay afloat. And so the private sector keeps shrinking as the government sector is growing, and we repeat the mistakes of the past. And the reason that I'm running, and the reason that I want to get to Washington before these guys completely destroy what's left of the country, is because the economic disaster that's coming is so much worse than the one we've just lived through. Because when this stimulus wears off, when we get the hangover, because remember, the stimulus is the problem. That's the source of the problem. Government stimulated our way into this crisis. The stimulus is toxic because all that's being stimulated is the disease. Right? It's not the cure. It is the disease. And the next downturn is going to be much worse because all we've done in the last year and a half is transfer trillions of dollars of private sector debt to the government. It's on the books of the Federal Reserve. It's been guaranteed by the government. The government is now guaranteeing 96% of all the mortgages in this country. They're buying up the student loans, the auto loans. All this debt that would have collapsed is now on the books of the U.S. government, which means you in this room are responsible for it. Government has grown like a cancer. The budget has exploded. Now the federal budget is $3.8 trillion for the next fiscal year. That's almost twice. The government is almost twice as big as it was 10 years ago. How can that be? How can we afford a government that's twice the size? We don't have twice the income. How can we afford it? And the deficit is so huge that the government is now spending $1.60 for every dollar they collect in taxes. I mean, how could they even call that a budget? How can you get together and say, well, how much are we earning? We're earning $1. Great, let's spend $1.60. I mean, so the crisis that's coming is going to be much worse. Because what's happening right now, we're keeping it all together. The Fed's got interest rates at 0. We know that's not right, right? How can interest rates be 0? How can that be the correct interest rate? Nobody's saving any money. Everybody's borrowing. How can rates be 0? That is creating a huge problem. And we're borrowing all this money from the Chinese, from the Japanese. Right now, people are worried about sovereign risk. People are worried about Greece. Maybe Greece can't pay their debt. Well, I got news for you. America can't pay its debts either. And people around the world are going to figure it out that we're not good for this money. And when the world stops lending, that's when the problems really begin. Because now the government can't bail anybody out anymore because it's the government that needs a bailout. And there's no one big enough to bail it out. The only thing that they got going for them is Ben Bernanke. Our leaders are convinced that he's going to print all the money that they need. That Ben Bernanke is going to buy up all this debt and it's going to be fine. And the crisis that's coming is not going to be a financial crisis, it's a currency crisis. And a currency crisis is worse. Because instead of worrying about losing your money in the bank, what you're worried about is your money having any value because you can't buy anything with it. That is the real crisis that's coming. And when the dollar collapses and prices go through the roof for everything we have to buy and interest rates go sky high and the unemployment rate is twice as high, now we're in a real crisis. And when President Obama says that the average American isn't going to have to pay for this stimulus, that's exactly who's paying for it. Because we're paying for it through inflation. They're not raising the taxes, they're debasing our money. And when they do that, the value of everything that you save goes down. The value of your paycheck goes down. Your standard of living goes down because your money is being stolen by the government through inflation. And so I want to go to Washington and put an end to this before it's too late. There isn't a single senator in the United States Senate right now that has a clue what's going on. Somebody needs to go there and let them know that they are the source of our problems. And every single thing that they've done has been wrong. And what they need to do is they need to abandon every single political instinct that they have and just do the opposite of what they've been doing. They got to be like George Costanza from Science. Because if they just did that, we'd be fine. Because the problem is career politicians approach a problem from their perspective. Because their problem is getting reelected. And oftentimes to get reelected, you do what is popular. But sometimes doing what's popular, or usually doing what's popular, is wrong, right?